At 29, Alora Marin had long stopped waiting for her life to start. Most people assumed that if you were beautiful and quiet and good, your story would eventually find you. Someone would come, something would shift, and the narrative would unfold. But for Alora, time had passed like fog through an abandoned field, silent, shapeless, and cruelly indifferent. Raised in the suffocating grip of a devoutly conservative household, where freedom was framed as rebellion and obedience was mistaken for virtue, Elora had spent most of her adult life trapped in her older brother's shadow. After their parents died in a fire that consumed more than just a home, Darren took over everything: the finances, the estate, and most importantly, Elora's choices. By the time she was 25, Darren had rejected 3 of her applications to move out on her own. By 26, he deleted emails from job offers she wasn't supposed to know about. And now at 29, she still lived in the same house her parents once owned, reduced to a silent ornament of family duty. She worked part-time for a local library, underpaid and overlooked, and every time she looked in the mirror, she wondered when exactly she had disappeared. The worst part wasn't that no one had saved her. It was that no one even noticed she needed saving. That changed the day she found the envelope. It had arrived without warning, delivered not to her, but to Darren, another sealed, crisp document in the stack of official-looking papers he liked to toss around like currency. But this envelope was different. It was heavier, marked in embossed silver with the name Haywood Enterprises. She didn't dare touch it directly, but she noticed how Darren's expression shifted when he opened it. Not smug, not annoyed, calculating. That was always a bad sign. That night, he called her to the dining room, where he sat alone at the head of the table like some king without a kingdom. Elora stood in the doorway, arms crossed, every inch of her body telling her to turn and leave. But she stayed. "You're going to be married," he said flatly, not even looking up from the paper. The words landed like a slap, not because they were shocking, but because they weren't. "To who?" she asked, her voice clipped. Darren finally looked at her. "To Laird Haywood." The name didn't register at first, then it hit like cold water. Laird Haywood, the reclusive billionaire. The man whose face she had seen on news sites and magazine covers, always in connection with headlines like "Hostile Takeover Shakes International Markets" or "Haywood Restructures Another Tech Giant." He was rumored to be ruthless, cold, a man who built his empire not through charm, but through fear. The kind of man who didn't ask for things. He acquired them. "You're joking," she said. "No," Darren replied. "He's interested in acquiring a new strategic partner in the East Coast market. His board wants him married. Statistically, married men present less risk. He needed someone clean, quiet, untied to scandal or media. And you," he smiled like it was a compliment, "fit perfectly." Her stomach churned. "I'm not a stock option." "You're not a person with options either," he snapped, pushing the papers toward her. "Our accounts are drying up. The estate taxes alone will drown us by the end of the year." He offered enough to save all of it. "Your name, our assets, everything." "My name," she said, her voice sharp. "It's the only thing you've got left to sell." Elora didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't throw anything, although the weight of fury in her chest made her fingers twitch with the desire to break something. Instead, she turned and walked out. And that, of course, only confirmed to Darren that she would comply. Because she always did. She had been conditioned to. That was his greatest mistake. The wedding was scheduled for the following Saturday. There would be no ceremony, no dress of her choosing, no vows. It was a contractual transaction, stripped of romance, full of cold logistics. Laird Haywood sent a legal team to oversee the paperwork and a stylist to ensure she would look presentable. They didn't ask for her opinion. They didn't send her anything with her name on it. She was a line item in a deal that involved empires and legacies she would never control. On the morning of the ceremony, Elora was driven to an estate 2 hours north of the city, set deep into a wooded landscape that seemed more fortress than home. The house was a monument to wealth, modernist, stark, and intimidating. She was met at the gates by a woman named Harper Vale, Laird's head of PR and, it seemed, his unofficial handler. "Please follow me," Harper said, cool and efficient. "Mr. Haywood is waiting in the study. We'll be signing everything at once." Elora followed her through corridors that felt like art galleries. High ceilings, slate floors, clean lines. Nothing warm, nothing welcoming. The study was a dark paneled room filled with books that didn't look read and a desk that looked like it could command armies. Laird stood when she entered. He was taller than she expected, dressed in a sharply tailored black suit that made him look less like a groom and more like a banker at a funeral. His hair was dark, just starting to gray at the temples. His features were sharp, striking, perfectly still. There was no emotion in his face, just assessment. "Elora," he said, extending a hand. His voice was low and steady, like a door slowly closing. "Laird," she replied, shaking his hand. It was the only physical contact they would have that day. They signed the papers in silence, broken only by Harper reading the clauses aloud. Financial terms, behavioral expectations, mutual privacy, media restrictions, optional renewal in 5 years. When it was done, Laird closed the folder and looked at her. "You'll have your own space in the house. You're free to move as you wish, but I expect discretion, no press, no scandals, no interference." "And in return," she asked, "you'll have security, access to private funds, your own staff. You'll be protected." She almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. She had never been protected in her life, and now she was being promised safety by a man who built his fortune on control. "That's generous," she said dryly. Laird looked at her then, not through her, not around her, but at her. And in that single glance, she felt something shift. Not warmth, not curiosity, but recognition. He hadn't expected her to speak like that. He hadn't expected her to meet his gaze with something closer to challenge than fear. "This marriage is a formality," he said. "But I won't insult you by pretending you don't matter." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. "Good," she said, "because I plan to matter." Later, in the room that had been designated as hers, Elora stood by the window looking out at the cold expanse of forest beyond the glass. Her suitcase sat unopened in the corner. The dress she'd worn was folded over a chair. She was no longer the woman who lived in someone else's house, waited for permission, or believed that silence meant peace. She was 29, married to a man who didn't want a wife, in a house that wasn't a home, with nothing ahead of her except space. And yet, for the first time, she didn't feel like she was standing still. For the first time, she felt like she had just stepped onto the edge of something dangerous. And maybe, finally, something hers. The first full day of marriage began in silence. Elora had expected that much. What she hadn't expected was how deliberate the silence would feel. Not like the absence of sound, but like the careful exclusion of connection. The estate was too quiet to be natural. Staff moved like ghosts through the halls, soft-footed and wordless, vanishing before she could greet them. Every item in her suite was in place, but nothing bore a trace of life. Her closet was stocked with clothes in her size, though she had never been measured. The bathroom had her favorite brand of soap, though she had never told anyone. Someone had clearly done their research, but the effect was unsettling, like walking into a life that had been curated for her without her permission. She wandered the house after a breakfast she barely touched. The architecture was brutal in its symmetry, a cold kind of beauty that mirrored its owner perfectly. There were floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the daylight, but none of its warmth. Sleek corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly without ever truly leading anywhere. Every surface gleamed. Every corner was calculated. It was a home built for power, not comfort. She didn't see Laird until early afternoon. He was in the atrium, seated at a long glass table littered with reports, tablets, and one steaming cup of coffee. He didn't look up as she entered, didn't acknowledge her until she walked to the far side of the table and stood without speaking. Eventually, he set the tablet down and leaned back, regarding her with that measured expression she was already beginning to recognize as his default. "You slept well?" he asked. Not a question, not really, a formality. "Well enough," she replied. His eyes flicked toward the seat across from him. She took it. A long pause passed between them. It wasn't tense, but it wasn't easy either. It was the silence of two strangers trying to locate common ground in a contract that offered none. "You're free to do as you like during the day," he said. "You'll have access to the library, the gardens, the East Wing offices if you're interested. There's a schedule for dinners, but your presence is not mandatory unless we have guests." "And if we do have guests?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Then I'll expect you to stand beside me and smile like you belong here. Her lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but not far from one. And do I? He considered her, the faintest flicker of amusement crossing his features. Time will tell. Does that mean you're still deciding? It means I'm still learning what I've signed up for. That makes two of us. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. You're not what I expected. Neither are you, she said. I thought you'd be crueler. He blinked, and for the first time, she saw something that resembled genuine surprise. I don't need to be cruel, he said. I just need to be clear. Well, let me be clear too, she said, matching his tone. I didn't ask for this marriage. I didn't want it. But now that I'm here, I have no intention of being a shadow. I never asked you to be one. No, she said, but you're used to women who don't speak unless spoken to. That's not me. Another silence. But this one was different. He was listening now, not just hearing. Listening. Finally, he nodded. Good. I don't need obedience. I need quiet competence. She arched a brow. You'll get neither if I'm treated like part of the furniture. Laird's mouth twitched again, just the faintest sign that beneath the polished exterior, something human still lived. They didn't speak of personal things, not yet. But he asked what she had studied. She told him literature, political theory, and linguistics. He asked why she hadn't pursued it professionally. She told him the truth. Her brother never let her. He didn't respond to that. But he didn't change the subject either. Instead, he handed her a tablet from the pile in front of him. Review this, he said. It's a proposed investment in a French fintech firm. Their numbers don't add up. Tell me what you see. She stared at the screen, then back at him. Why me? Because you're observant, and because I want to know how you think. It wasn't affection, it wasn't respect, but it was something close to curiosity. She took the tablet without another word and left the room. The rest of the day passed in a haze of reading. She sat in her suite by the window, dissecting the proposal like she used to do with classic novels, searching for inconsistencies, hidden meanings, the flaws in what someone wanted her to believe. And just before dinner, she sent him a message through the internal house system. Their long-term projections are inflated by 17%. Their user-based data was manipulated with conversion metrics from an unrelated platform. You're being pitched a narrative, not a business. Elora. There was no reply, but at dinner he sat down across from her and said simply, You were right. No congratulations. No thanks. Just quiet acknowledgement. She could live with that. Afterwards, she returned to her suite. She stared at her reflection in the mirror. No makeup, no jewelry, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. She didn't look like a billionaire's wife. She looked like herself, finally free of pretense. This house wasn't hers. This marriage wasn't love. But something in her chest felt sharper now, more alive. Maybe it was dignity. Maybe it was the beginning of something dangerous. Maybe it was the sound of her own power, finally waking up. Elora woke up the next morning with a strange feeling in her chest. Something between restlessness and anticipation. The house around her was silent, but it no longer felt oppressive. It was starting to feel like a stage. She moved through it deliberately, learning the way light poured into each room at different hours of the day, how the staff rotated between wings like clockwork, how the entire place functioned like a living organism, structured, efficient, and always watching. She wasn't naive enough to believe her movements weren't being observed. She was the newest element in a system that didn't tolerate unpredictability. But that didn't bother her. In fact, she welcomed it. Let them watch. Let them report. The more they underestimated her, the easier it would be to move freely. By mid-morning, she was in the East Wing, where Laird's private offices were located. The wing was quieter than the rest of the house, filled with dark wood, thick carpeting, and the faint scent of cologne and paper. She wasn't sure what had drawn her there exactly. Curiosity, perhaps, or the unspoken invitation Laird had extended the day before when he asked for her opinion on the fintech deal. That hadn't been a test. It had been a challenge, and she had passed. She found Harper Vale waiting outside the main conference room, clipboard in hand, dressed immaculately in black slacks and a fitted jacket, her expression as unreadable as always. When she saw Elora approaching, her lips twitched into a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mrs. Haywood, Harper said, I wasn't aware you had scheduled an appearance this morning. I don't need to schedule my movements, Alora said calmly. This is my home too, isn't it? Harper gave a slow nod, stepping aside. Of course, but the meeting inside is a closed financial review. And I'm married to the man whose name is on those reports. Harper hesitated, then with a tight smile, opened the door and gestured her inside. As you wish. The conference room was filled with people in suits. Analysts, lawyers, and executive advisors sat around a long polished table, murmuring to each other, their screens lit with live data feeds. The moment Alora stepped inside, every head turned. The air shifted. Laird, who had been seated at the head of the table, looked up, his face unreadable. For a brief second, there was stillness. And then he gestured to the empty seat beside him. Have a seat, he said. Not a question, not a command. Just space made for her. She took the chair without hesitation. The room held its collective breath as the presentation resumed. A junior analyst with a nervous smile clicked through slides detailing the projected revenue of a Latin American renewable energy partnership. The numbers looked polished, the narrative confident. But Alora had spent enough time around men like her brother to know when someone was dressing up a lie. She waited until the analyst clicked to the slide labeled Market Entry Forecast, then leaned forward, eyes on the data. Your forecast assumes first quarter gains in a region with political instability and fluctuating energy policies, she said, her voice steady. You're basing your model on last year's political alliances, not the ones currently forming. Your assumption of a stable entry point is flawed. Silence. The analyst's smile faltered. One of the advisors cleared his throat. I don't believe Mrs. Haywood, he began, but Laird cut him off without raising his voice. She's right. Pull the numbers. Recheck the model. And just like that, the room shifted again. No one questioned her presence after that. No one even looked surprised when she stayed until the meeting ended, occasionally asking pointed questions, occasionally listening silently with the cool focus of someone who had never been invited but had no intention of leaving. After the meeting, as the others filtered out, Laird remained seated. He didn't look at her right away, just tapped his fingers against the edge of the table. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. Yes, I did, Alora replied. If I'm going to be the woman standing beside you in headlines, I should know what kind of empire I'm standing in. His eyes lifted to hers. You didn't just stand beside me today. You took control of the room. Did it bother you? No, he said after a long pause. It reminded me of something I'd forgotten. What's that? That intelligence isn't always loud. They sat in silence for a moment. There was something different in his posture now, a subtle easing of his shoulders, a faint thawing in the gaze that had been so carefully guarded from the start. He stood, walked to the bar at the edge of the room, and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass. He handed it to her. You earned this. I don't drink, she said. Then don't, he replied, but keep the glass. It means something. She took it without drinking, holding it like a symbol. And maybe it was. That evening, after dinner had passed without words and the hallways once again dimmed to shadow, Alora found herself outside the old music room on the 2nd floor. She didn't know why she paused there. Maybe it was the faint echo of keys being pressed. Someone had once played here. Maybe Margot. Maybe someone else. The door creaked slightly as she pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with dust and memory. A grand piano sat in the center, its lid open, waiting. She crossed to it slowly, placed the glass of untouched whiskey on top, and sat at the bench. Her fingers hovered above the keys for a moment, then began to play. Not perfectly, not even skillfully, but with something more honest than either. The melody was simple, sad, true. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her until they were close. Laird stood in the doorway, silent, listening. He said nothing. She didn't stop playing. When the song ended, she looked over her shoulder at him. That's what power sounds like, she said, and he nodded, because he knew she wasn't wrong. The days following the conference room meeting passed like a slow unraveling of tension that neither Alora nor Laird acknowledged out loud. Something had shifted, subtle, unspoken, but palpable enough that even the staff began to adjust the way they moved around the house. Doors were left slightly ajar, small courtesies were extended to Alora that hadn't been there before, and people no longer avoided eye contact when passing her in the hallways. She wasn't invisible anymore, and while no one had told her she belonged, the absence of resistance was a quiet kind of welcome. Laird remained composed and distant, as he always had, but the lines between them had blurred. He no longer retreated to his study the moment dinner ended. Occasionally, he lingered at the table, asking questions that felt almost personal: what she read as a child, whether she believed people were born cruel or shaped that way, if she thought all choices came with regret. These weren't romantic exchanges, not yet. They were intellectual, philosophical, and sometimes disarmingly honest. It was through these conversations that Alora began to see glimpses of the man beneath the armor. Not the CEO, not the billionaire. Just the man. She learned that he hated public events but attended them religiously because investors liked the illusion of availability. He rarely drank alone, never slept more than 5 hours, and had an aversion to disloyalty so sharp it bordered on obsession. She also learned he kept a room in the West Wing, locked at all times, not for security, but for memory. When she asked what was inside, he told her only, "A life I couldn't fix." One evening, Harper approached Alora in the upstairs library. She stood in the doorway like a warning, arms folded tightly across her chest, eyes narrowed with professional suspicion. Alora closed the book she was reading and looked up without fear. "You're making waves," Harper said without preamble. "Is that a problem?" Alora replied calmly. "It's a variable, and Laird doesn't like variables." "Then he shouldn't have married one." Harper stepped farther into the room. "You're clever, but don't mistake relevance for permanence. His attention is earned in minutes and lost in seconds." "I'm not trying to keep his attention," Alora said. "I'm trying to understand his world. Because whether or not you like it, I'm part of it now." Harper paused, then lowered her voice. "People like you, outsiders, rarely last. You may think you're adapting, but this place will swallow you if you stop moving." Elora stood, her expression composed but firm. "Then it's a good thing I stopped being afraid of being devoured." She didn't wait for Harper's reply. She walked past her, her posture straight, her heartbeat steady. The hallway felt darker that night, but it didn't scare her. Not anymore. The following weekend, Laird informed her of a formal dinner being hosted at the estate, a last-minute arrangement with two major international partners who were on the verge of finalizing a deal with one of Haywood Global's European subsidiaries. It was meant to be small, exclusive, highly strategic. Her presence, Laird explained, was expected. Not required, but expected. Elora took it as a test. She chose her dress carefully. Deep emerald satin, elegant and understated, with a silhouette that exuded both strength and grace. She wore her hair pinned at the nape of her neck, left her makeup light, and wore no jewelry but her wedding band. When she entered the grand dining hall, every conversation paused. She could feel the weight of male gazes assessing her, measuring her usefulness, her poise, her presence. But she didn't falter. She smiled softly and took her place beside Laird at the head of the table. The men seated across from them, one French, one Dutch, were charming in the way dangerous men often were. Their compliments were laced with condescension, their questions disguised as polite interest. At one point, the Dutchman raised his glass and said, "You're quite the surprising choice, Mrs. Haywood. We were expecting someone more visible." Elora met his eyes evenly. Visibility doesn't equate to value. Diamonds are buried for a reason. There was a beat of silence, followed by a ripple of laughter. But it wasn't mocking. It was impressed. Laird didn't laugh. He simply looked at her, one corner of his mouth twitching slightly and the closest thing to a smile she'd ever seen on him. After dessert, she excused herself and stepped out onto the balcony to breathe. The night air was cool and sharp, filled with the scent of early blooms and the distant hum of evening traffic from the private road beyond the estate. She stood at the edge, her hands resting on the railing, heart pounding, not with fear but with adrenaline. She was still there when Laird joined her. "You handled them well," he said. "They expected a doll. I gave them a blade." He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her not as a solution, not as a contract, but as a person. "Why haven't you run?" he asked suddenly. "You had chances, even before the wedding." She turned toward him, the wind catching a loose strand of her hair. "Because I was tired of surviving in places where I wasn't seen. At least here, I'm building something, even if it's just myself." He studied her for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't open it. He didn't offer it. He just held it out. "I bought this before the wedding. Harper thought we should have something for photos in case the press ever wanted proof." Elora took it carefully, opening the lid. Inside was a ring, platinum, minimalist, elegant. It wasn't romantic. It was a symbol. I don't want you to wear it if it feels like a shackle, he said. But if you ever decide it's something else, it's yours. She closed the box and held it to her chest. I'll decide when I'm ready, she said. He nodded and they stood in silence for a while. Two people forged by necessity, shaped by scars, and finally, quietly, starting to choose each other. Not out of desperation, but maybe, just maybe, because they wanted to. The morning after the dinner party, Elora woke to a subtle, foreign stillness. Not the cold kind of silence that had once dominated the halls of the Haywood estate, but a soft, reflective quiet that felt almost earned. The early light streamed through the tall windows of her suite, casting long streaks of gold across the rug, and for the first time in days she did not reach immediately for her phone or a file to review. She sat in bed, knees drawn to her chest, replaying the night before. The voices, the stares, the way she had spoken without fear, the way Laird had looked at her afterward. Not as a puzzle or a responsibility, but as someone who mattered. She wasn't foolish enough to call it love, but it was something. Something real enough that it stayed with her, even in the quiet moments. She got dressed slowly and made her way to the breakfast room, half expecting it to be empty as usual. But Laird was already there, seated at the head of the table with a cup of coffee in hand and his eyes on the paper. He glanced up when she entered, and though he said nothing, he gestured to the seat beside him. That in itself was unusual. He rarely asked for proximity unless there was a purpose. She sat, and for a while, the only sounds between them were the clink of silverware and the turning of pages. Then, without looking at her, he said, "They've invited us to Geneva next month." Elora tilted her head. "The investors? Group Felon. They want to move forward with the renewable energy merger, and they'd like both of us present for the initial announcement. And you want me there because? Because your presence solidifies the image they want. And because you speak French better than I do." Elora smirked. "So I'm not just a contract anymore. I'm a translator too? You're whatever you choose to be, but for now you're an asset." She hated that word, but in his mouth it didn't sound like an insult. It sounded like respect. "I'll go," she said, "but not to perform. I don't want performance. I want precision." She finished her tea and set the cup down carefully. "Then you'll get both." Later that day, Elora wandered the estate grounds, something she hadn't done much since arriving. The gardens were expansive, divided into clean quadrants with low walls and rows of manicured hedges. But beyond them, past the fountains and the carefully paved walkways, was a forested path that seemed less curated, more natural. She followed it on instinct, letting her feet move without direction, her mind drifting. She found the greenhouse by accident. It stood quietly among the trees, ivy curling around the glass, the air inside fogged and warm. The door creaked open when she touched it, and a wave of earthy scent met her. Jasmine, wet soil, the faint sweetness of ripe fruit. Inside were plants of every shape and size, arranged with an artist's care and a scientist's precision. She recognized some of them from books. Orchids, miniature citrus trees, rare medicinal herbs. A small wooden bench sat in the corner, worn and used. She stood there for a long moment, letting herself exhale, really exhale, for the first time in days. "You found it," came Laird's voice behind her. She turned. He stood just inside the door, his hands in the pockets of a dark jacket, eyes not on her, but on the plants. "I didn't know this was here," she said. "It's the only place on the property I built myself. Everything else was inherited or remodeled." "It's beautiful. It's alive," he said, stepping farther in. "And it doesn't ask for anything but care." She watched him as he moved among the plants, gently brushing a fallen petal off one of the pots. "You built a sanctuary," she said. "I needed something that didn't speak, that didn't require apologies." He glanced up then, catching her gaze. "It was the only way I knew how to grieve." "For her?" Elora asked softly. He nodded once. "Margot didn't like the cold. She said it made her feel like she was fading. After she died, I couldn't stay in the house for weeks. This helped." She moved to stand beside him, her fingers trailing the edge of a tall fern. "You never talk about her." "There's nothing new to say." That doesn't mean she stopped mattering. They stood in silence, the kind that comes only when pain is allowed to exist without interruption. You're not like her, he said after a long time. I know, but you're not less. Elora looked at him then, not guarded, not cautious, just open. You still think this marriage is a shield? I used to think it was, he admitted. Now I think it's a door, one I never meant to open. Are you afraid of what's on the other side? He met her gaze. Only if you are. She shook her head slowly. I stopped being afraid the moment I stopped asking for permission. He reached out then, almost hesitantly, and took her hand. His grip wasn't possessive. It was searching, warm, honest. For the first time, Elora didn't pull away. Later that evening, as the house began to dim and settle into its nightly quiet, she stood in front of the mirror in her suite. Her reflection looked different, not softer, stronger. Her eyes carried weight now. Her posture no longer shrank to make others comfortable. She touched the ring box on the dresser, still unopened. Then she picked it up and slipped the ring on her finger. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. It rained the next day. Not a soft drizzle or spring-like mist, but a relentless, cold storm that washed the color from the sky and rattled the windows of the estate. The sound of it became a backdrop to everything: meetings, meals, thoughts. Elora stood at the tall window in the music room, arms crossed over her chest, watching the downpour blur the world outside. Her thoughts were heavier than the clouds. The conversation in the greenhouse had stayed with her like a bruise she kept pressing, not to test the pain, but to remember it was real. Laird had shown her something vulnerable, something she suspected he had buried for years, and she had answered with honesty of her own. Their marriage no longer felt like a disguise. It felt like something alive, shifting beneath them both, changing shape with every conversation, every look. She had worn the ring the entire day without thinking about it. Only once did she catch her reflection in the hallway mirror and pause. There it was, gleaming, elegant, a symbol not of possession, but of a promise not yet spoken aloud. She hadn't mentioned it to Laird. He hadn't asked. But when they crossed paths near the main staircase that afternoon, she saw the way his eyes dropped, just briefly, to her hand. And she saw the flicker of something unspoken in his expression. Not triumph, not relief, just acknowledgement. As if he understood what it meant and what it didn't. That evening, Harper summoned her to the West Wing with a tight voice and a clipped message. Urgent meeting. Elora arrived to find Laird seated at the long glass table, flanked by Harper and two men she didn't recognize, both in expensive suits, both radiating a quiet, coiled tension. The kind of men who weren't used to being questioned. Laird looked up when she entered, but he didn't greet her. Instead, he gestured for her to take the seat beside him. She did. Harper wasted no time. We have a situation, she said, placing a stack of printed documents in front of them. A leak, financial and personal. Someone's been feeding internal documents to Theo Grange's team for weeks. Contracts, projections, and, most recently, your marriage license. Elora's spine stiffened. They're planning to expose us? They're planning to destroy you, one of the men said. If they can prove your marriage was a strategic arrangement and not a genuine partnership, it will call into question the entire merger. The board in Geneva is already nervous. Laird said nothing. His face was carved from stone, his body still as if made from marble. But Elora could feel the heat rolling off him. Not panic, rage. Controlled, calculated rage. Do we know who leaked it? She asked. We're narrowing it down, Harper replied. But we suspect someone inside the estate, possibly even someone from your brother's circle. Darren, Elora whispered. Of course, it made sense. He had always needed her to be something useful. If she had slipped from his control, why not cash in on her one more time? Laird finally spoke. I'll handle the board, but we need to control the story before Grange does. And how do we do that? Elora asked. With you, Harper said. A joint statement, a media appearance, something that shows unity, commitment, authenticity. Laird looked at her. We'll say as much or as little as you want, but it has to come from us. Elora nodded slowly, her mind racing. Fine, but no scripts, no rehearsals. If we do this, it's on my terms. Harper blinked. You'll be walking into fire. I know, Elora said, but I'm not made of glass. The press conference was scheduled for 48 hours later, to be broadcast from the estate's media room, a sleek, modern space designed for shareholder calls and rare executive announcements. The moment it was announced, speculation exploded online. Headlines danced across every outlet. Heiress or hostage? The coldest marriage in corporate history? Is Haywood hiding a lie behind his wife's smile? Elora didn't flinch at the noise. She had weathered worse. She had survived silences far more dangerous than words. On the night before the broadcast, Laird found her in the greenhouse. She was tending to the orchids, her hands dirt-smudged and careful. He didn't speak at first, just stood behind her and waited. "I thought you hated this kind of attention," she said without turning. "I do." "Then why trust me to take the lead?" "Because you're the only person I've met who doesn't care what I think of her." She turned then, slowly, and met his eyes. "That's not true. I care. I just won't be defined by it." He stepped closer. "Why are you still here, Elora? You could walk away. No one would blame you." "I stayed because I didn't want to run anymore," she said. "And because you stopped pretending I was disposable." He exhaled, and in that breath, something inside him softened. "I don't know how to offer affection," he admitted. "I never learned." "You don't have to offer it like a gift," she said. "Just don't hold it like a weapon." He reached out then, slowly, deliberately, and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. It was the gentlest thing he'd ever done. Not possessive, not performative, just real. "I won't let them break you," he said. "They can't," she replied, "because they never built me." They stood in the greenhouse until long after the lights went out, until the storm of the day gave way to stillness, until there was nothing between them but breath and truth. And for the first time, neither of them felt like they were pretending. Tomorrow the world would try to unravel them, but tonight they stood whole, together and unafraid. The morning of the broadcast began with a rare quiet, not the guarded silence of strained civility that had once filled the halls of the Haywood estate, but the calm that follows a storm no one ran from. Elora stood before the tall mirror in her suite, dressed in a charcoal gray blouse with a soft silk collar and sharply tailored black pants that gave her both elegance and edge. She didn't want the public to see a doll in a dress, someone smoothed over by stylists and handlers. She wanted them to see her, the woman who had been given away, who had clawed back her voice, who now stood beside a man not because she needed him, but because she had chosen not to walk away. Outside, the estate buzzed with movement. A media team had arrived early. Set designers, camera crews, lighting technicians, all coordinated with Harper's brutal efficiency. No one dared speak to Elora unless spoken to. Even Harper herself, usually sharp-tongued and visibly skeptical, kept her distance. There was no denying now that Elora had grown into her space. No longer an outsider, no longer a chess piece moved by others. She found Laird in the prep room next to the studio, standing with his back to her, adjusting the cuffs of his black suit. When he turned at the sound of the door, his expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for her to see that this wasn't just business for him anymore. He looked at her like a man who understood exactly what she was about to do for both of them, and who would remember it for the rest of his life. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to," he said. "This is your call." "I know," she replied, "but I've already been silent for most of my life. That ends today." They walked together into the studio, a sleek room with minimalist design, cool lighting, and a single camera framed directly in front of two chairs. A large monitor displayed a muted feed of the press waiting outside. Reporters, commentators, cameras pointed at the estate gates. The world was watching. They sat. Elora straightened her shoulders and folded her hands gently in her lap. The makeup artist had offered to apply a bolder look, but she had refused. She wanted her freckles to show, her brows untouched, her mouth bare. If she was going to be picked apart, she'd do it wearing her own face. The countdown began. 10 seconds. Then 5, and then the red light blinked on. Laird began first, his tone measured but clear. He acknowledged the questions surrounding the timeline of their marriage, the recent leaks, and the business merger. He didn't deny that the initial arrangement was strategic. He didn't spin it as a fairy tale. What he did say with quiet precision was that in Elora, he found something he didn't know he needed: truth, strength, and an unwillingness to be shaped by expectation. Then the camera turned to her. Elora took a breath, not to calm herself, but to center her voice. And then she spoke. I didn't marry Laird Haywood because I fell in love. I didn't grow up dreaming of a man in a black suit with cold eyes and a colder legacy. I didn't even know him when I walked into this house. And I'm not ashamed of that. The words were raw, deliberate. I was raised to keep quiet, to be grateful for whatever life handed me, even if it was nothing. I spent years learning how to shrink, how to disappear in rooms where my voice wasn't wanted. When I was told I'd be married off for the sake of someone else's business deal, I didn't protest. I survived. She looked directly into the lens now, unblinking. But survival isn't the same as living. And what I found here, unexpectedly, painfully, honestly, was the space to become myself. Not because of Laird, not for him, but alongside him. We built something. Maybe it didn't start with love. Maybe it still isn't that. But it's real, and it's ours. And no one gets to define it but us. There was a long, tense pause. The silence after her final sentence felt like the breath before impact. The studio crew behind the cameras were still. Laird, beside her, didn't reach for her hand or nod or try to affirm what she'd said. He simply looked at her like he'd never truly seen her until now. The feed cut. The silence in the room remained unbroken for several seconds. Then Harper stepped forward, speaking into her headset, coordinating the media team's exit. A murmur of voices picked up as producers scrambled to get reactions from outside news outlets. The online feed was already trending. The clip of Elora's speech had gone viral within minutes. But she didn't hear any of it. She was still staring ahead, her pulse steady, her chest full. Laird spoke softly beside her. "You were flawless." She turned toward him. "I wasn't trying to be. I was just done hiding." "You don't need to hide, Manlant," he said. "Not here. Not anymore." For the first time since they'd married, he reached for her hand. Not performative. Not because people were watching, but because he wanted her to feel it. "I meant what I said," she told him. "So did I." They stood and walked out of the studio into the corridor, where sunlight now spilled through the windows. The storm had passed. The scandal hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. The narrative was no longer out of their hands. That night, the two of them had dinner alone in the smaller dining room, the one rarely used except for quiet, private evenings. There were no files on the table, no questions about quarterly earnings or upcoming travel. Just 2 plates of food and a shared bottle of wine. At one point, Elora laughed, a full, rich laugh at something dry and sardonic Laird had said. He looked stunned for a moment, as if the sound had startled something awake in him. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked, still smiling. "Because that's the first time you've laughed like that since I met you," he said. "And I think it might be the best thing I've ever heard." Elora felt the warmth of the wine, but it was the way he said it that made her feel unsteady. "You're not what I expected," she said. "Neither are you," he replied. And in the comfortable quiet that followed, they both knew, without pressure, without declarations, without drama, that something real had finally begun. It wasn't love yet, but it was getting there. The days that followed the broadcast settled into a rhythm that neither Elora nor Laird had expected. It wasn't peace, not entirely, but it was something close. The scandal that had threatened to dismantle their public image didn't vanish overnight, but its teeth had been dulled. The public's perception shifted almost instantly after the press conference. Headlines turned from skepticism to fascination. Commentators called Elora poised, sharp, unexpected. There were viral videos praising her refusal to pretend, articles titled "Not Just a Trophy Wife, Who is Elora Marin?" and 1,000 think pieces trying to define her on behalf of the very world she had just told to stop doing so. She didn't respond to any of them. She let the world talk while she stayed quiet, not out of fear or passivity, but by choice. There was power in letting others exhaust themselves on surface narratives while she focused on what truly mattered, what came next. Her relationship with Laird had begun to shift in ways neither of them spoke aloud. They didn't suddenly become tender or overly familiar. They didn't hold hands at breakfast or kiss in front of the staff. But there was closeness now. Real closeness. The kind that shows itself in passing glances and shared silences that no longer feel strained. Sometimes he would join her in the greenhouse without saying a word, standing beside her as she watered the orchids. Sometimes she would walk into the library to find him already reading something she'd once recommended, bookmarked halfway through, waiting for her to catch up so they could talk about it. It was a slow build, steady and cautious, as if they both understood they were walking across a bridge they were still constructing with every step. Then came the dinner invitation. It arrived in the form of an embossed envelope handed directly to Alora by Harper, whose expression gave nothing away. Inside was a single card, elegant and formal, an invitation from Geneva's most influential business family, the Bravants, known for their financial power and their ability to make or break international deals with a single meeting. They were hosting a private dinner in the city for a carefully curated list of global CEOs and power players, and they had invited Laird and his wife. "I assume you're coming," Harper said, her voice neutral. "I am," Alora replied. "Why, why wouldn't I?" Harper hesitated. "Because you'll be walking into a room where no one will want you there. They'll smile, they'll nod, but they'll look for cracks in your posture and flaws in your speech. You'll be scrutinized in ways even Laird hasn't been." "Then I suppose I'd better give them something worth remembering," Elora said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The preparations took days, though Elora refused any stylists or handlers. She selected her own gown, a sleek midnight blue dress with long sleeves and an open back, elegant but armor-like. She did her own makeup, styled her own hair, and when she emerged into the hallway where Laird waited for her, even he paused. He didn't compliment her. He didn't need to. He offered his arm and she took it. The dinner in Geneva was held at a private estate overlooking the lake, a building that glowed with golden light and echoed with quiet, polished conversations. The Bravants greeted them at the door with carefully performed warmth. Inside, the guests were a gallery of the powerful, men and women who had shaped industries, ended governments, and rewritten laws to suit their interests. And yet, when Elora entered beside Laird, the room didn't pause in confusion or disdain. It paused in respect. She didn't dominate the conversation. She didn't try to prove herself. Instead, she asked precise questions and offered sharper observations. When one man made a patronizing comment about women in business, she dissected his company's underperformance over the last 3 quarters with a smile so polite it left him speechless. When another asked if her role was more supportive than strategic, she replied, "I'm here because I have better instincts than the people he used to trust." Laird said almost nothing through most of the evening. He didn't need to. He watched her, listened to her, let her take the lead in a way that made it clear this wasn't just his empire anymore. It was theirs. After the final course, they stepped onto the balcony overlooking the water. The night was cool, the breeze soft, and the city glittered below like scattered gold. "I was expecting you to stay quiet tonight," Laird said quietly, handing her a glass of wine. "I was expecting you to want me to," Elora replied. "I did, a month ago. And now? Now I find it hard to remember what this life was before you spoke." They stood there in the hush, shoulder to shoulder, neither one rushing to fill the space between them with words. When Elora turned to face him, he looked at her not with his usual guarded calculation, but with something new, something unspoken, tender, almost reverent. "You changed everything," he said. "So did you," she replied. And then finally he kissed her, not in hunger or urgency, but in recognition. A kiss that was quiet and grounded, filled with all the things they had never said but had been building towards since the first contract was signed. It was not the beginning of their story, but the point at which everything else fell away and only truth remained. That night they did not return to separate rooms. They didn't speak of love in grand declarations, didn't make promises under starlight. But when they lay side by side, fingers intertwined, breath steady, Elora realized that she had found something no one could ever bargain away from her. She had found herself, and in doing so she had found something she never thought she'd earn. Not safety, not luxury, not even love, but freedom, real, soul-deep freedom. The kind that came from being seen, chosen, and believed in. Not for what she could offer, but for who she had always been. And this time, she wasn't giving it up. Not for anything.